a room of one's own, I'm really excited to have with me Jeremy Godwin today, tuning in from Australia. I discovered his podcast on Spotify called Let's Talk About Mental Health. Heard across 114 countries and played over 200,000 times. It it constitutes of digestible content around mental well-being and easy tricks and tips to stay afloat during our daily lives. So, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. Hello from Australia.
So you have a podcast which is across these platforms, but you could have put out this content on any platform whatsoever. But why did you choose Spotify and why did you choose podcast as your tool to communicate?
Really good question. There's two parts for that. First of all, the whole idea of doing a podcast, at the time that I started about almost a year and a half ago, podcasts was starting to take off a little bit, and I'd sort of listened to a couple of them off and on. And I thought that's a really good way for me to be able to sit and get things out without feeling the pressure of adding video to it. And for me, I'll be honest, I felt really self-conscious on video, and that's something I'm still working on. So, which is ironic because I've just launched YouTube a couple of weeks ago. But anyway, so for me, it was a case of, all right, well, podcast is a good way to look at it, and I really enjoy talking. And then second of all, in terms of the actual platform itself, I'm an Apple user, but I'm conscious of the fact that not everybody is. And Spotify has been getting bigger and bigger over the last few years. And so I did a little bit of research around, okay, what's the easiest way to do a podcast and which has the biggest in terms of audience and the ability to be able to share that out really easily. And Anchor kept on coming up time and time again, which is an app that's available. You can also use it as a browser online. I'm not paid to advertise them, just let me be very clear. I'm just an avid user of Anchor. And so I did a little bit of research, and at the time, I started my podcast in October of 2019, and they had just been acquired by Spotify sort of 6 or 7 months earlier. So I took that as being a very good sign that Spotify were investing in them. And I have to admit, I was right, because now I saw a statistic from Spotify in an article last week, which was that in 2020, 80% of new podcasts on Spotify were made with Anchor. So for me, it's a really easy system. You dump in your audio, you chuck in a couple of things, and then it distributes it out to about 10 or 12 different platforms. And it also aggregates all of the reporting into one. And I love the analytics side of it so that I can try to see trends and things like that. So for me, that was a no-brainer.
Makes sense. So why don't you take me through your process? So I'm sure it starts with ideating and then drafting, recording, editing,
Yeah.
releasing, and perhaps in tracking and analyzing the data about who's listening to it, what got most traffic, and all of that. So take me through it.
Yep. Absolutely. Well, look, just a 20 seconds bit of context here. My background before I started doing this was in the corporate sector, and I used to be a trainer. So I designed and delivered training programs to a whole range of levels. So I come already with that particular type of knowledge. But then I've also worked on the operations side. So I kind of look at how do you make things actually work in terms of actually practicing things. So that underpins a lot of the work that I do. And then having transitioned over to mental health, I've brought a lot of that mindset to what I do. So I now approach the podcast creation very much like I would have done in terms of content design back in my old job. I brainstorm topics. If I could turn the camera around, I would. I've got a wall here covered in post-it notes, which are just single words that are ideas for subjects. And I'll plan those out a couple of weeks in advance. And then once I've decided on what the next episode is going to be, the first thing that I do is the research component. And that's probably the biggest chunk of the time. One of the things that I'm really pedantic about with my podcast is that everything has to be based in fact. And I believe, and part of this is my background in terms of studying psychology and sociology, I believe that we've gone way too far past the point of trusting and believing in science. And so for me, a foundation of my podcast is being able to back up everything that I say with actual evidence. So I'm all for alternative theories, but you need to show me the data to demonstrate. Please don't just tell me that the sky is red when we all know that the sky is blue. So that's a big part of it. I do a lot of research. I look at as many peer-reviewed articles as I can, and also mental health organizations from around the world. There's quite a lot of resources that I tend to draw, especially from countries like Canada, the US, the UK, and Australia. And so then I bring all of that together and say, okay, great. Here's all the knowledge. Here's the stuff that helps to back up my perspective on it. Now let me put that in a ball, stick that over there, and actually talk from the heart in terms of my experiences with that particular topic and where I see an opportunity for a different, newer conversation to happen in that space. I just don't see the point in repeating things that are already out there, because there are over 1 million podcasts and counting on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. I just think I don't want my podcast to be the exact same thing that everyone else is talking about. So once I've done that, I'll write the podcast. That's a fairly straightforward process, and recording it's fairly straightforward as well. I use Audacity because it's free, it plays well with Mac, and once you kind of teach yourself the basics, it's easy to edit the audio out of it. You may have noticed with us talking, I'm really conscious of this anyway. I have a bit of one of my nostrils is permanently blocked, which means I have some challenges with breathing in terms of breathing quite heavily when I have to take a breath. And so when I listen to my podcast back, it's all I can hear and it drives me nuts. I'm sure nobody else would probably notice it, but now that I've said it, everyone will be listening for it. So I sit here and I edit all of that out. So what would probably only be a couple of hours ends up taking me a whole day to edit out all of the stuff, and where you inevitably have to say things 3 times over because you stumble over a word or whatever. And then that's it. Once it's done, it's just all mixed together in GarageBand and sent out. And after that, it's sort of do a bit of promotion on social media. And I think that's probably the bit that I know I need to get a little bit better at. Unfortunately, because the market is so saturated in podcasts and YouTube and all of that stuff, you can't just put something out there and go, oh, people will come, fingers crossed. It is very much a case of it does take work. And personally, it is something that I'm still trying to find the balance between promoting my work and being not being pushy around it, if that makes sense. So those
It
things take
does.
time.
Mm-hmm. No, now I understand when you said that your content is very anecdotal. It is indeed, it is very relatable. It is anecdotal, as well as it's very realistic, and you're very direct. If
Yes.
you're very clear with your listeners that if you're interested in real knowledge that can help you take action to improve your present circumstances, go ahead, listen to the podcast. If you're not going to be conscious about the errors you're making in your daily life and are not willing to make these little alterations here and there, they're not going to work for you. So you might as well not come to my podcast. So when I was reading more about where this started from, I understood that you were facing sort of a breakdown in your personal life, and that's when this idea came to you. So, why don't you tell me about the inspiration behind this endeavor?
Absolutely. And as you said, I talk about this quite openly in my show. I think I opened the first episode by talking about it within a couple of minutes. For me, I went through a period in the late 2000s and early 2010s where I wasn't dealing with a lot of the issues that I had in life, both in terms of family and financial and personal, and just in terms of, look, I mean, I was working in corporate and I was stuck in a job that I hated. And when I say, you can change jobs as many times as you like, but when you are in a career field that you're miserable in, but you're refusing to admit that to yourself, you're not making life easy for yourself. So I was in that situation and I was drinking heavily as a form of coping. I also am prone to emotional eating, which is part of the reason why I'm quite self-conscious on camera at the moment, because I lapsed back into it a year ago. But anyway, so I was dealing with all of that, and then it got to late 2011, and I had come back from holidays, and I went into work, and I sat down in my office, and I think I lasted 15 minutes. I put my head in my hands, and burst into tears, and I just could not physically do it anymore. So I left, got in my car. I still to this day have no idea what happened between getting in my car and getting home half an hour later. I do not remember the drive at all. I completely blacked out. And that then led into a couple of weeks worth of just absolute, um, to say that I went from a breakdown to being suicidal within 2 weeks is absolutely no understatement. The depression and anxiety was so severe that I could barely get out of bed. Anyway, so that's sort of a little bit of the positioning of what started this journey for me. I went through quite a few years of dealing with that. And I remember I was sat there in a therapy session about a year after all of this, and I was starting to get a little bit of clarity back in my mind. I was still quite depressed and severely anxious. And I remember all of a sudden sort of stepping outside of myself and looking at what the conversation was between myself and my therapist. And I went, this is what I need to be doing. This is what I want to do. This to me feels far more fulfilling than the idea of going back to the corporate sector. So I started having a look around, and I decided to go and study to become a licensed therapist. And I got 3 years into it and just went, oh, this is doing my head in. And for me, it was a lot more about problems than it was solutions. And I say that with absolute respect to therapists, because I see what they do in terms of helping people to find solutions. But I felt that it was a lot more about diagnosing and dealing with the problem side of things rather than having that sort of more solution focused and self ownership focus that is really sort of fundamental to who I am as a person. So I switched over and finished my degree, sort of still doing the psych side, but doing sociology as well, because I'm interested in how society influences us on an individual level as well as at a group level. And I'm really glad that I did, because that underpins a lot of the work that I do now. Because I think what we do is we get into a situation where we think, and this comes back to what you said before about what I'm very upfront about in my podcast, we think that we can go and see a therapist and that they will give us all the answers. And we also tend to think, and I think we've been sold this idea, that we can pop a couple of pills and do some therapy and that will resolve everything. And then when that doesn't happen, and inevitably that won't happen because that's not how life works, what happens to us is that we get disillusioned, and then we go around in these spirals where, we're disillusioned, we do things to try to fill those gaps or get ourselves past the pain that we might be dealing with internally. What we need to be doing is really having some honest conversations. And so I called my podcast Let's Talk About Mental Health for 2 reasons. The first is that, yes, we should be talking about it more. It's a subject that until quite recently has been taboo. And 100 years ago, if you admitted that you had severe depression, you would have been put into an asylum. So yes, it is a conversation that still needs to happen. However, more than anything, the conversation that we really need to have is the really honest conversation with ourselves. If you're struggling with something, rather than trying to put a band-aid over that and trying to gloss over the problems, actually having a realistic and honest conversation and confronting what you're going through is going to be really painful to start with, but what it's going to do is help you to really look at the truth and come at it from a perspective of dealing with the root cause of your issues, rather than just saying, I'll be fine. I'll buy myself another handbag, or I'll have another glass or two of wine and I will be good. Because eventually those things will catch up with you if you don't deal with them.
That's an excellent advice, and I love how your journey has been and how you've taken inspiration from your own experiences to help other people out through your initiatives. So kudos to that. Um,
Thank you.
During this pandemic, I think we have all been forced to face ourselves,
Yeah.
intrinsically our own insecurities, because we're spending more time with ourselves thanks to these social distancing rules.
Yeah.
We're at home, we can't meet our friends, so we are looking at priorities. We are kind of judging ourselves and understanding, is this the system we want to fit in, or just looking at how the society functions. And I feel, and I think statistically it shows that um, there have been more mental health challenges now more than ever. because people are introspecting more. So, what's your perspective on that, and how do you advise people to protect their mental well being during this time?
Some good questions there, some big questions. Look, in terms of where we're at and what has happened and what's continuing to happen. And just as an aside, I saw a meme going around this morning on Instagram that was where I think in the UK they're talking about it might be until 2024 until things go back to normal. And I use quotes there because normal is in the eye of the beholder. But realistically, this is something that we're going through that is absolutely one in 100 years type of event. Before we started recording today, you and I were talking about all of this stuff, and I hope you don't mind. I'll just hark back to that conversation. As I said to you in that discussion, if you want to put a really fine point on it, the last time that something this big and this global happened was World War II back in 1940s, in the first half of the 1940s. So, we're talking about people like you and I in our age group. I mean, I'm probably being generous with my age there, but people in this age group, we have no idea what it is like to go through this. And the thing that's really unique about this event is that it's affected not just one or two or five countries, it's affected every single country in the world, every single person in every country. Now, whether or not people actually believe in COVID is a whole other story, but I'll let that go. So, realistically, this is absolutely fundamentally a life-changing event. Whether you want to admit it or not, is completely up to you. And denial is not just a river in Egypt. So it's very much a case of saying, all right, well, we've been going through this now for a year. We're pretty much coming up to a year. And we have been forced to spend time with ourselves in ways that we have never had to even contemplate, let alone actually do. And so for a lot of us, it's come down to either putting your head in the sand and pretending that everything's fine, which there's only so long that you can do that for before you suffocate, or it's a case of saying, whether I want this to be true or not, what I need to do is lean into it and face reality. And I talk a lot in my podcast about reality and about realistic optimism, which is a nice way of saying, don't delude yourself that the entire world is going to be rainbows and unicorns, because unfortunately bad things do happen and that is part of life, it's inevitable. But also, when you look at the way that life is, for the most part, things turn out for the best. And even the bad things that happen to us in life have an opportunity to teach us something. They can push us to grow. And whether or not we would have chosen this, most of us probably wouldn't, but whether we like it or not, it has pushed us to actually grow, to go inside of ourselves and confront what really matters in life. If you think back to the first couple of months when all of this started back in March and April of last year, and none of us knew what was going on. And, for me, I'm prone to anxiety. I've pretty much dealt with my depression now, but I still live with anxiety and it takes daily work to manage it. I remember going to the supermarket because, I know this sounds really random, but online ordering had been suspended. So I had to go back to doing it in the supermarket. And for someone with anxiety, being around people in the middle of a pandemic, I was hyperventilating by the time I got out of the supermarket. And I remember everybody walking around in stunned silence. And I had never experienced that before. And you had old people who were wearing masks and gloves. And I live in a small country town. I'm originally from the city, but I moved here a few years ago with my partner. And out here, most things don't concern people. But to see the elderly walking around with fear in their eyes broke my heart. And for me, a lot of that also came around the time that my mother has dementia and has been dealing with a lot more health issues as a result of that. And she was moved into a home in September of last year. And so I've sort of sat back and watched some of the arguments that have been happening about, oh, but we don't want to, we've had it here in Australia, we don't want to have to wear face masks in public. It goes against our freedom and, depends on what country you're in and whatever. And there's a part of me that just thought, do you know what? I don't like wearing a face mask. I wear glasses and I find it really hard to breathe as it is because of my nostril issue. And so when I put a face mask on, I look like an idiot. And you wear glasses too. So you fog up your glasses and all of these things. I've just gone and ordered
Absolutely.
one of those. It's so frustrating. I've ordered one of those
It's
nose things that you can put in to help breathe properly.
it's a
But
real
you know
struggle.
what? It's such a struggle for those of us that wear glasses. But do you know what? It's either I do that or I contribute to being part of the problem. You know, we had, as I'm sure
Absolutely.
happened in Canada and as I know has happened elsewhere, we had issues where um, it ripped through aged care centres. And now my mother's in one of those. And I just think, and I am getting to a point, I just think that this pandemic has done one really important thing, and that is to remind the majority of us of our shared humanity. We are one people. I don't care what you look like, who you sleep with, what you do for a living, whether or not you like RuPaul's Drag Race. I don't care who you are. You know, we are we all are the same on the inside and we're all susceptible to this virus. And you can either fight that fact and make life more difficult for yourself and other people, because I'm a very firm believer that what you put out, you bring back to yourself. But it's also a case of being at peace with yourself. You know, I talk in the podcast about if you do three things: if you do no harm, if you are kind to yourself and to other people, and if you give more than you take, those things actually help to lay the foundation for really strong mental health and well-being, because you're able to be more comfortable with who you are, but you're also able to build and maintain better relationships with people just by virtue of those three simple ideas.
Wow, that's some excellent advice right in there. I think something you spoke about, which is extremely significant, is shared humanity. We may not take notice of how we are contributing to bit of positivity in somebody's lives, but we all influence e- everybody we pass by. We touch more lives than we imagine
Yeah.
we do. You spoke about the challenges of anxiety and the daily work that goes into
Mm.
improving it on an everyday basis. Can you speak a little more about that? As somebody who has anxiety too, I feel like
Mhm.
it's hard work managing it on a daily basis. It's
It
legit
is
hard
hard
work.
work.
It should be in
Yeah.
our to-do list, I think. Manage anxiety
Yeah.
today.
Absolutely. And, you know, using today's conversation as an example, we've had a couple of jokes at the beginning of this because it took us a good 15 minutes to sort everything out because, you know, Mercury retrograde. But, you know, for someone who has anxiety, I don't know about you, but I'm highly organized and highly prepared. So I make a point when I've got meetings of being sat at the computer, ready to go 2 minutes before the meeting, as in literally I will sit here waiting to click the button to start the meeting because I like to be on time for things. So when things go into a meltdown, I'm kind of like, and you know, and that's the reason why I share that is because that can be a common experience for many of us. Whether you're hyper organized or not has nothing to do with it. It's an example of the fact that during the course of a day, things will go wrong, and you can either fight that fact or you can accept that fact. And I think part of what happens for those of us that live with anxiety is that we get quite overwhelmed by some of the things that are going on, whether they're big or small. And so when other things come at us out of nowhere, it can make it even worse. So some of the things that I do every day, and you know, I don't get it right every single day. I have good days and I have bad days, and a lot of that is linked to what's going on here, but also what's going on here, um, and also what happens outside in the world. But for the majority of it, I do the things that are very commonly talked about. I have a daily gratitude practice every single morning. I do consciously practice mindfulness for 5 or 10 minutes. I struggle to sit still beyond 5 or 10 minutes. And what I do, and this is the big one that works for me, is every time I have an idea of something that needs to be done, and running my own business, as you know, probably know, it's very hectic. What I will do is write down the things that I need to do, but then I have a do now, do soon, and do later list. And the do later list sits at the back of my notebook, and I don't look at it on a regular basis. Because if I looked at everything that I need to do, it's going to drive me nuts. What I focus on with the do now is that I will only focus on one or two big ticket items per day. And then I will have a maximum of 3 to 5 smaller items that need to be done every day. So part of that for me is about not overwhelming myself, because I can get easily overwhelmed with a long to-do list. And also part of that is about saying that if I can get a few little things done and I can feel that sense of achievement that goes with that, it sets me up for success the following day and the following day and the following day. And I think we quite often feel as though we need to get everything done all at once, and really we don't. If you take the time to step back and think about, what are you really working towards in life? What are your actual priorities? For me, it's my partner, it's my family, and it's doing work that feels authentic to me. So that means I limit the number of clients that I see as a coach and counselor. I limit the number of companies that I work with as a consultant around mental health and well-being to one or two at a time, because the money is not worth the added stress if I were to take on 3 or 4 or 5 clients. I limit the number of conversations that I have with people that are outside of the scope of that, because my personal time is really important to me. So I think it's just about every day I will, I know it sounds really weird, but every day I will literally just remind myself of what are the 3 to 5 priorities in my life, what really matters. And if something doesn't fit within those priorities, done, off to the side. If I get time to do it, great, but it's not going to rock my world. And ever since I started doing that, my anxiety levels have gone from up here to dropped down to a good 6 or 7 on a bad day, and a good 2 or 3 on a really good day, if that makes sense.
Yes, absolutely. I think I learned a thing or two because I tend to make long to-do lists
Mm,
every day. Like they're really long, but then I take them and then it still gives me a sense of accomplishment when I've done the major chunk of those lists. Something
yeah.
that, yeah, something that's personally helped me is journaling and
Mm.
at least mentioning 2 or 3 things that were positive in the day. And it could be literally anything, it could be not such cold weather in Canada, like a sunny day, to just having good food,
Yeah.
and then uh,
Can I just pick
right.
up on that point there? Because I think the other bit that I didn't mention, and I think it sits very well with what you're talking about as well, whether you call it journaling or you call it reflection, and I talk about reflection in the podcast all the time, to the point where I now make jokes about the fact that, guess what I'm about to talk about. I make a point every evening before I go to bed, just as I switch off the light, I think for no more than 30 to 45 seconds about 3 things that I'm really pleased with that happened during the course of the day.
Mhm.
Even if it was a bad day, I don't focus on those. I just focus on 3 little things that it's a form of gratitude, but it's also
It's
a
a
form
form
of
of gratitude.
reflecting from it. And so I think by bookending the day in terms of starting with gratitude and also reflecting in a grateful way at the end of the day, what you do over time is that you highlight the positive more, and the negative is always going to be there. Again, that's part of life. So let's not labor under the assumption that we can get around for the rest of our lives and never have any pain or heartache, and that we're only going to be happy all the time, because life does not work like that. What we need to do is be able to set ourselves up for the best chance of being able to deal with setbacks if and when they happen. So by being grateful and focusing on the positive, when you focus on positive things, you attract more positivity to you. And you also kind of look at the negative stuff and go, well, does it really matter in the big scheme of things? And sometimes it
Mhm.
will, and that's okay. But the majority of the things that we get caught up in and we get hung up on really don't matter. You won't remember them in 5 weeks, let alone 5 years' time. So, if you can start to be not start to be, but if you can really focus on being as positive as possible about that stuff without being delusional, but as positive as possible, and saying, all right, well, the negative stuff is here and I'm going to deal with it, but it's not taking my focus away from what is good in my life. And here are the things that are good.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that this helps with is that when you're really anxious or perhaps on a peak of depression or just numbed to whatever's going around you or inside of you, when you
Mm-hmm.
open that, you see moments that made you happy. If not happy, they would provide you
Mm.
with a sense of feeling a little close to yourself that you have been able
Yeah.
to do things all this while. So you are capable of pulling yourself together, even if it will happen maybe in a few days, maybe in a couple of weeks,
Mhm.
but you will be fine again and you will be able to get back to where you were.
Absolutely. And can I just on that, you've just reminded me of something. First thing this morning, it's morning over here. I received an email this morning from, I don't know if you've heard of futureme.com, where you can write yourself a letter in the future. I had forgotten I had done this a year ago. I wrote myself a letter. So it was before COVID happened. It was before our 17-year-old cat Pushka had died. And so it was a very different time in my life. And this letter came today, and I sat there reading it this morning, and I've actually stuck a reminder on it to come back and read it tomorrow again, because I need time to actually reflect on it before I can kind of process it fully. But what I did in there is exactly what we've just been talking about. I was really, really realistic with myself about the stuff that I'm grateful for, as well as the stuff that hadn't been going so well, and talked about some of the things that I was hopeful and optimistic about happening in the future. And I read that this morning and I thought, you know what? I'm actually going to make a point tomorrow of writing myself another one of these and just sticking it on a random date to come to myself in the future, because it just inspired. I know that sounds really egotistical. I inspired myself, but it inspired me because this was me from a year ago talking to myself and telling me all of the things that I was so incredibly grateful for at the time, while still acknowledging that there was some stuff that I was struggling with at the time, and here's what it is, and I'm still working through this and whatnot. I think that those types of exercises, like you say, being able to look back a week later or a year later and see where you were at and really process and think honestly about how far you've come. Because life is not about a big series of events. Life doesn't just happen with weddings and birthdays and funerals. Life is actually made up of the small details. It's very much about the cumulative things that happen on a day-to-day basis. And if you spend 5 or 10 minutes a day on gratitude and reflection, then you come back in a year's time and you've got 365 days worth of things that you've been reflecting on and being grateful for. And that stuff adds up. And you can make these incremental changes in your mindset for things and help yourself to be more realistically optimistic by just taking 5 minutes a day, because that stuff will build up over time. Anyway, it just popped into my head about it, and I thought I'll talk about that.
No, that's such a good one. I'm going to check that out too. I didn't know there was a thing that existed like that. So I'm going to check that out. So thanks for that.
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
good.
but I believe you when, because, yeah, I'm actually reading a book by Mary Andrew. It's called Where Am I There Yet? And it
Okay.
actually says that, we see life as a zigzag right now when we're living it, that it's going right
Mm-hmm.
and left and, linear and then U-turns and everything. But when you look back in a couple of years, you'll
Mm-hmm.
see that it all was on one path to take you where you are now.
Yeah.
So, and
I say that
even
about, sorry to jump in. I say that about mental health all the time. It's some people kind of think that I'm a little too overly positive by saying this, but I would not trade everything that I went through, breakdown, suicidal feelings, depression, anxiety. I would not trade any of it for the world, because without that, I wouldn't be where I am today. And you don't know that stuff when you're in it. If you focus on today and you are hopeful for the future, but you focus on being the best version of yourself possible today, you'll be amazed what happens when you look back in 5 years' time, because you'll realize that even the difficult stuff helped to guide you down a path that is so much different to where you are. But it's really, I don't know, it feels rewarding.
definitely, I think your life is made up of choices that you make and the choices that you
Yes,
do not choose to make. So,
100%.
absolutely. I think we've had such a good conversation about mental well-being, pandemic, and real things that we could do to improve our overall well-being. And that is precisely about two things: taking action and being hopeful. So, taking small steps every day to
Yes.
make your life feel better and not just depending on an external body, perhaps a therapist or anybody else, to be their savior, be that savior for you, but you have to confront your own emotions, your insecurities, and it's going to be a hard journey. Nobody likes to do
Yes.
that, but that's what will make you feel better if you are hopeful and you are inspired to continue that journey, because as you said, it's going to be rewarding. So thank you for being here today with me, and
Thank
I'm
you.
sure my readers are going to enjoy this conversation.
Fantastic. Well, I hope that they do.